The surgeon told my father the bullet missed my spine by 3 inches. My father said, "Good, good," and went straight back to his phone call with my brother. 4 hours into my surgery, my mother stood in the hallway outside recovery telling Preston the scare was over, that none of it mattered now that he was safe. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 33 years old, the older of 2 children, and for most of my life I have been the family's quiet infrastructure. Preston is the face over the door. I am the wiring behind the wall that keeps the lights on. Our grandfather, Augustus Calloway, built Calloway Hospitality Group out of a single roadside motel outside Joliet, Illinois in 1968, vinyl bedspreads, a coffee maker bolted to the nightstand so nobody could walk off with it. He grew that one motel into 41 hotels across 11 states, one property at a time, until the family name meant marble lobbies and a certain kind of Chicago respectability nobody in our family had actually been born with. He also, when I was 10 years old, taught me to shoot. Not for sport. In 1971, 3 years after he opened that first motel, a man walked in at 11 at night and put a pistol to my grandfather's temple for $62 in the register. Gus survived it. He never got over the specific, total helplessness of that moment, a grown man on his knees over pocket change. So every summer at the lake house in Wisconsin, while other grandfathers taught their grandkids to fish, mine lined up cans on a fence post and taught me how to breathe out slow before I pulled a trigger. Preston hated the noise. He quit after one lesson and went back to skipping stones off the dock, which the whole family found charming. I kept going every summer, long after other 10-year-old girl hobbies would have made more sense, because it turned out I was good at it, and because it was the one thing in my life that belonged only to me and nobody had opinions about. Callaways don't flinch, Gus used to say, resetting the cans. It wasn't a company motto. It was never printed on stationery or hung in a lobby. It was just ours, a private joke that was only half a joke, and I didn't understand until much later that he'd been trying to give a granddaughter nobody else thought needed one thing, a way to survive being underestimated. Because I was, cheerfully, constantly my entire life. I run operations for a hospitality company with 41 properties, which means I know which ice machines fail every August, which general managers are quietly drowning, which line item in a quarterly report is lying to you 3 weeks before the auditors ever catch it. Nobody puts that on a stage. Preston is Executive Vice President of Brand, a title our father invented specifically so his son would have somewhere official to stand at a ribbon cutting. Our parents have spent 3 years telling the board he's ready to be chairman. I have spent 3 years making sure the hotels he'll inherit still have working plumbing on the day he inherits them. I want to be honest about something, because none of the rest of this makes sense otherwise. I resented my brother. I also would have died for him. Both were true at the same time for the entirety of both our lives, and I never had to choose between them until the night of June the 4th, at a black tie gala in our own flagship ballroom, when something in my body chose for me before my mind caught up. The gala was for Lakeshore Children's Hospital, raising money for a new pediatric wing, 400 donors in black tie-under chandeliers my grandfather bought secondhand from a demolished opera house in 1994 because he liked the story more than the price. My mother arranged the toast formation herself, the way she arranged everything. Preston front and center, alone under the chandelier light, me 3 steps back. "Move back, Nora," she'd said, adjusting my shoulder like I was a lamp in the wrong corner of a room. "We need a clean shot of just Preston." I moved back. I always moved back. I stood there with a champagne flute I wasn't drinking, watching my little brother lift his glass to 400 people who loved him for reasons that had nothing to do with who he actually was, and something at the edge of the crowd didn't match. A man, still in a way nobody else in that ballroom was still, not watching the stage the way a donor watches a stage, watching a spot on it fixed, the way you watch something you're waiting to happen. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember my grandfather's voice, out of nowhere 8 years after his funeral, "Breathe out slow." I remember covering the distance between myself and my brother faster than 400 witnesses could process, because some part of me had been quietly rehearsing that exact motion since I was 10 years old on a dock in Wisconsin, and nobody, including me, had ever taken it seriously enough to notice. The shot that was meant to pass near Preston went through me instead. I want to tell you what happened next cleanly. It doesn't come back that way. It comes back in pieces, fluorescent light tilting sideways, the specific brand of chaos 400 people in evening wear make when they realize the sound was not a drop tray, a stranger's hands pressed flat and hard against my side. "Stay with me, look at me, what's your name?" "Nora," I told him, because it seemed important in that particular moment that at least one person in the building learn it first. He rode in the ambulance. He wasn't supposed to, he was a gala guest, not staff, a tuxedo jacket getting permanently ruined against my side, but he told the paramedics he was a trauma surgeon in a voice that made people stop asking questions, and he held pressure on the wound the entire ride. When we hit a pothole on Lakeshore Drive, and I made a sound I am still not proud of, he said low and even, close to my ear, "You're allowed to be loud. Nobody in this ambulance is grading you." His name was Elliot Grange. That's all I knew about him when they wheeled me back for surgery, and it's all I knew for 3 more days, because I was unconscious for the 4 hours my mother spent in a hallway consoling my brother, and unconscious for a good while after that too. When I finally surfaced, he was the one sitting in the chair by the window, not my family. He wasn't even supposed to be there anymore. My actual surgical team had rotated off hours earlier, but he'd stayed, in borrowed scrubs, reading a golf magazine so old the cover had gone soft at the corners. "You again," I said. My voice came out like gravel dragged across concrete. "Me again." He set the magazine face down without marking his page, which told me he hadn't actually been reading it. "For the record, your vitals stabilized within the hour. I stayed because the coffee in this hospital is genuinely criminal and I needed someone to complain to about it." It wasn't the truth. We both knew it wasn't the truth, but it let me laugh instead of the alternative, and lying there with 41 staples holding my side together, I understood that had been the entire point of saying it. My mother arrived 20 minutes after I woke up, not 20 minutes after I was wheeled out of the OR. She'd been in the building that whole time, 1 floor up, in the family waiting lounge with the good coffee. 20 minutes after I actually opened my eyes and a nurse paged her. She kissed my forehead. She told me I looked pale. Then, before she asked how I felt, before she asked anything else at all, she asked whether Preston should cancel his sit-down with the Tribune or push it to Thursday. "He's so shaken," she said, "he hasn't slept." I had a drain in my side and a morphine pump I was rationing out of some stubborn instinct I didn't examine too closely, and my mother was triaging my brother's sleep schedule at my bedside. "I could have died, Mom," I said. It was the first time I'd said the sentence out loud, partly to test how it sounded and partly to see if it would land. "You didn't, though." She smoothed the blanket over my knees, the exact motion she used on hotel bedspreads during a property inspection. "You're stable, he wasn't. That's just triage, Nora. Don't make it a whole thing." Don't make it a whole thing. I turned that sentence over so many times in the weeks that followed it lost its shape entirely, the way any word does if you repeat it enough. Preston visited on the 3rd day, once I'd graduated to real food and a lower dose of everything. He sat down in the chair Elliot had claimed. Elliot was off doing actual rounds for once, and held my hand for exactly as long as it took him to say what he'd driven over to say. "You have no idea what this has been like for me," he said, "knowing someone wanted me dead. I keep replaying it. I haven't slept. My girlfriend had to cancel our trip to Positano." I looked at my brother, 29 years old, tanned even in a Chicago June, uninjured, telling me about a canceled vacation while I couldn't sit upright without a nurse's help. "I got shot, Preston," I said in case the distinction had somehow escaped him. "I know." He squeezed my hand once, already thumbing his phone awake with his other hand. "It's been so hard for all of us." He left 40 minutes later for the Tribune interview after all. I watched it that night on the hospital television, propped against pillows that smelled like industrial detergent, my brother in a crisp blue shirt telling a reporter he'd never felt closer to his family, that they'd rallied around him like nothing he'd ever experienced. He didn't say my name, not once in 6 minutes of television. Elliot came back in as the segment ended and took one look at my face before he reached over and turned it off without asking permission. "I brought you an actual sandwich," he said, holding up a paper bag like evidence. "Real turkey. Not whatever felony the cafeteria is committing downstairs. You don't have to keep doing this." Noted. He sat, unwrapped his own, and settled in like there was nowhere else on the entire eastern seaboard he needed to be. Choosing to anyway. Different thing. My father visited exactly once that week, on the 5th day, standing rather than sitting, still in the suit from whatever meeting he'd left to be there. He didn't ask how I felt either. He told me the board loved a hero story, that resilience narratives moved institutional shareholders more than quarterly numbers ever did, and that I should let the story ride until after the vote. Callaways don't flinch, Nora. He said it like he was quoting a stock price. Your grandfather taught you that for a reason, apparently. Use it. We'll deal with how you feel about all this after the vote. He kissed the top of my head on his way out, the way you'd pat a vending machine that finally gave your dollar back. I lay there a long time after he left, turning that sentence over. We'll deal with how you feel about all this after the vote. As though grief and terror were line items that could be deferred to whatever date suited somebody else's calendar. On the sixth night, when the nurses weren't looking, Elliot broke me out. Not far. Just a wheelchair ride down a service elevator to a small courtyard garden the hospital kept for staff, a patch of grass and 2 benches nobody official had approved for patients. He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders like he'd done it 100 times and parked us facing the one clear patch of sky Chicago's skyline allowed. This is probably a HIPAA violation, I said. Several, likely. He sat on the bench beside the wheelchair, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. I'm choosing to risk my license for the fresh air, try to look grateful. We didn't talk about my family. We didn't talk about the gala at all. He told me, unprompted, about the worst patient he'd ever had, a man who tried to leave against medical advice 4 separate times to get back to a fantasy football draft, and I laughed hard enough that my staples pulled, and he noticed instantly, the way he noticed everything about my body before I'd finished registering it myself. Easy, his hand found mine without any ceremony about it, like it was simply where his hand belonged. You're allowed to heal at the speed you heal at. Nobody's timing you. Everybody in my family is timing me. I noticed. Something in his voice went flat and serious for just a moment. I don't operate on your family's clock, just so that's clear going forward. I found out what he actually was 2 days later entirely by accident. My mother called while he was in the room, deep into a spreadsheet on his own phone, and I had her on speaker, because sitting up to hold the phone still pulled at the drain site. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to someone on her events team mid-stride, the particular brisk voice she used for vendors. We need the Grange Foundation locked in for next year, she was saying. Whoever runs that thing is a total recluse. We've never so much as met the man. He just wires the check and disappears. If we lose that gift, the pediatric wing renovation stalls completely. Elliot went very still over his coffee. You, I said slowly, the Grange Foundation is you? Technically my grandmother's name is on the building. He said it the way a person admits to a minor parking violation, not a double life. I fund the cardiology unit. I didn't want people being nice to me in an ER because of a plaque on a wall, so I kept it quiet, and then it just stopped feeling worth correcting. You let me think you were just some doctor. I am just some doctor, the almost smile again, the one I was starting to recognize as his real one. I'm also, apparently, the reason your mother is currently begging a room full of party planners for a meeting with myself. Strangest Tuesday I've had in years. I laughed until it hurt everywhere at once, and for once I didn't try to make it stop. They discharged me on the 9th day. Elliot drove me home himself, refusing to let anyone call a car service, and when we passed within 2 blocks of the Callaway Grand on the way, he didn't say anything about it, just reached over without looking and put his hand flat over mine on the console until the building was behind us. You don't have to go back in there today, he said, or tomorrow, or ever if that's what you decide. It's my family's hotel. I'm aware of whose hotel it is. His jaw was tight in a way I hadn't seen on him yet. I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be yours to walk back into on anyone's schedule but your own. I didn't have an answer for that yet. I just let him keep his hand where it was for 3 more blocks, which at the time felt like the loudest thing either of us had said all week. Marion Voss came to see me a few days after I got home, ostensibly with flowers she clearly hadn't chosen herself, the kind of arrangement an assistant grabs from a shop on the way over. Marion had been Callaway Hospitality's general counsel for 28 years. She'd notarized my grandfather's final will. On her office desk, in a frame nobody else would have thought to buy, sat a photograph of me at 19 in an oversized hard hat at the topping out ceremony for our Nashville property, the only person in that entire company who'd ever thought to take one. The board's calling an emergency shareholder vote, she said, arranging tulips into a vase that didn't need arranging. 9 days from now. A conglomerate called Meridian Hotel Group put in a buyout offer 6 weeks ago. and half our institutional shareholders were leaning toward taking it. Your father's been fighting it every way he knows how. What does that have to do with me getting shot? Her hands stopped on the tulips for a fraction of a second too long. Nothing, she said, too fast. I just thought you should know the timeline. I didn't understand yet why that answer felt like a held breath. I filed it away anyway, the way I file away every number in a report that doesn't quite balance, and let it sit. It was Elliot, a couple of days later, who mentioned Marcus Doyle. Your family's new head of event security, he said half to himself, watching me grind through a set of physical therapy stretches that made me want to scream into a pillow. He talked to Preston for a solid 10 minutes before the toast that night. I remember because of what he kept saying. Stay close to the stage tonight, don't wander off, struck me as strange phrasing for security, sounded more like stage direction than protection. I didn't think much of it, either, not yet. I had a drain site and a merger vote and a mother who'd called my near-death triage. I didn't have room yet for the idea that somebody had choreographed the worst night of my life on purpose. The police handed us the tidy version not long after. Daniel Pruitt, 34, priors for trespassing and disorderly conduct, no ties to our family, apprehended 2 blocks from the Callaway Grand with the weapon still on him and a note in his jacket about people like us never paying for what we had. Case closed. A lone man with a grudge and the terrible luck of choosing that ballroom on that particular night. My father held a press conference on the hotel's front steps to announce it, flanked by security, thanking the swift response of our internal team for preventing further tragedy. He did not mention that further tragedy had already happened to his daughter, who watched the whole thing muted on a hospital-branded television 2 miles away. Something about that story itched at me the way a wrong number on a balance sheet itches, long before you can say exactly why. I asked Marion for the police report. She hesitated 3 full seconds before bringing it, which I noted and didn't mention yet. I read it twice, the angle was wrong. I'd spent 20 summers on a range learning the difference between a controlled shot and a panicked one, the flat, level angle a person produces bracing on a fixed stance, feet planted, versus the jerking upward arc of a weapon coming up in a crowd, adrenaline spiking, somebody's elbow in your ribs. The report described Pruitt firing from inside the crowd, jostled moving, but the angle on my own wound, the one I'd watched a radiologist trace on a screen without fully understanding what I was looking at, was level, flat, the kind of shot you take from a stance. Nobody had jostled that man. I'd been 3 feet away. I remembered his stillness before I remembered almost anything else about that night. I didn't say any of it out loud yet. I wrote it in the Notes app on my phone instead, in the same place I keep every detail about this company that refuses to balance. The breaking point came not long after that, at the one event I was pulled out of the house and into real clothes for. A press photo in the hospital chapel, the whole family gathered for what my mother's team called a moment of gratitude, timed with a precision that should have told me everything by itself. I stood where they positioned me, staples still healing tight under a borrowed blazer, while Preston stood front and center under the chapel's soft, forgiving light, and my mother arranged us exactly the way she'd arranged the toast, and something in my hip pulled wrong and I flinched, just barely, just enough to knead the wall. Nora. My mother's voice was pitched for the photographer and for me at the same time, which is its own particular skill. Stop making this about attention. We are so far past that. I looked at my mother's face, composed, camera ready. Not one flicker of the woman who should have been the most frightened person in that room, because her daughter had very nearly died and she was currently more concerned with a lighting angle. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. Something in me that had spent 3 years absorbing this exact category of damage simply, quietly, stopped absorbing it. Okay, I said, and let the photographer take his picture. That night I called Marion Voss and asked her a direct question for the first time in my life. What aren't you telling me? Marion didn't answer on the phone. She showed up at my apartment 3 days later instead and sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was the only warm thing left in the building. I've worked for your father for 28 years, she said. I've buried things for this family I'm not proud of. I told myself it was loyalty. I told myself nobody ever really got hurt. Her hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the cup against the saucer. Nobody was supposed to get hurt this time either. I wish I could tell you I already knew what she was about to say. I didn't. Weeks of suspicion hadn't braced me for it actually landing. Marcus Doyle works for a private security contractor your father retained 6 weeks ago, Marion said. Off the books. Paid through a consulting shell called Aldridge Risk Partners. I processed those invoices myself and didn't ask what they were for, because I learned a long time ago not to ask your father questions he hadn't already decided to answer. What was the money for, Marion? A controlled incident. She said the phrase like it tasted wrong in her mouth. Your father needed the board frightened enough to invoke a clause in our bylaws. It lets the sitting chairman delay any vote 60 days if there's a material threat to named family leadership. He needed sympathy. He needed time. Meridian's offer expires in 61 days. A scare, a foiled attack, Preston pulled to safety by his own security team on camera. A headline. A delay. Nobody was ever supposed to fire a live round into a room with 400 people in it. Then what happened? Doyle told Pruitt to make it look real. Fire once, aim high, let himself get caught before he could do it again. Marion's voice dropped almost to nothing. Pruitt panicked when Preston stepped forward toward the crowd instead of staying where he'd been positioned to stand. The shot went low instead of high. She looked up at me, and I watched her finally say the part that had clearly been sitting in her chest for weeks. And you were never supposed to be anywhere near that line at all. I sat with that for a long moment. My own father had paid a stranger to fire a gun into a ballroom full of children's hospital donors to buy himself 60 days, and a sympathetic headline, and it had nearly killed me by accident, a rounding error in a plan that had never once accounted for me at all. Why tell me now? Because Doyle called me last week. Marion's composure finally broke straight down the middle, told me to make sure the invoices were unfundable before the vote. Told me, word for word, that a woman my age with a pension doesn't want to be difficult. She wiped her eyes hard with the back of her hand, furious at her own tears. I have spent 28 years being loyal to the wrong people in this building. I am done. Here is what I know now, pieced together from Marion's memory of it, and from emails that surfaced weeks later, though I wasn't in the room for any of it myself and want to be honest about that. 3 nights before the gala, in a locked office on the 40th floor of the Callaway Grand, my father sat across from Marcus Doyle and asked, in the flattest voice Marion had ever heard him use in 28 years, whether Doyle's people could make the board understand what was at stake, viscerally, before the vote. Doyle asked how viscerally he meant. My father didn't answer that directly. He said he trusted Doyle to be creative, and that Aldridge Risk Partners would see a bonus for creativity that read well in the press. Nobody in that office said the word gun out loud, nobody had to. I didn't know any of this while I was lying in a hospital bed memorizing a water stain on the ceiling, timing my own breathing the way my grandfather taught me on a dock in Wisconsin 30 years ago. I found out 3 weeks later. By then I already had my own proof sitting right next to it, the wrong angle, the 2-level shot, the stillness of a man who hadn't been watching a stage the way 400 donors watch a stage. A few nights after that, Elliot found me at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, surrounded by printed pages I was absolutely not supposed to have anymore, given that my badge access to the building had quietly stopped working days earlier. An HR email had cited my recovery and urged me to take all the time I needed, as though locking me out of my own office were a kindness. You should be asleep, Elliot said, and then, taking in my face, sat down instead of arguing the point further. I told him everything, Doyle. Aldridge Risk Partners, the clause, the flat, level angle of my own wound. He listened without interrupting once, which I was starting to understand was simply the shape of him, and when I finished he reached across the table and turned my wrist over, gently, to look at the healing scar the way he'd check his own surgical work. You already used up your one reckless, selfless act for the decade, he said. Whatever you decide to do next, you call me before you do anything that gets you shot again. I'm saying that as a medical instruction. I'm also saying it as the other thing. Which thing is that? You know which thing. He didn't let go of my wrist. You don't have to earn the right to be safe. Not with me, not ever again. It wasn't a declaration, not in so many words. It didn't need to be. I had spent my entire life being told, in 100 small transactions, that safety was something you qualified for with good behavior. He said it like it was simply, uncomplicatedly, mine. 4 days before the vote, my father's team placed an item with a friendly reporter. I read it over Elliot's shoulder in a hospital cafeteria during my next follow-up, my coffee going cold in my hand. The piece was gentle, sympathetic, devastating in exactly the way gentle things can be. Unnamed sources close to the family expressed concern that Nora Calloway, still processing significant trauma, had become confused about the timeline of events and was struggling to separate nightmares from memory. It never called me a liar. It didn't need to. It simply made sure that anything I said afterward would arrive pre-discredited, wrapped in gentle concern, easy to wave off in a boardroom full of people who wanted an easy reason not to believe me. That same afternoon, Marion called to say she couldn't testify. Doyle came to my office, she said, her voice flat in a way that frightened me more than crying would have. He didn't threaten me directly. He mentioned my daughter's law school tuition. He mentioned how easily an invoice trail could somehow implicate whoever processed it, if it ever surfaced. A long pause, full of static. I have a family, Nora. I'm sorry. I can't. I sat in my kitchen that night with a case that had just lost its lawyer, a public narrative quietly repositioning me as an unreliable, traumatized woman, and a vote in 4 days that would hand my father 60 more clean days to bury everything for good. For the first time since the chapel, I let myself believe it might actually be over. I drove myself to the range that weekend, the real one downtown, where I'd kept a membership under a different name for 6 years, because Calloway Hospitality did business with half the board members' husbands, and I'd learned early that nobody needed to know where I went on Saturday mornings. I hadn't been able to raise my right arm past my shoulder in 3 weeks. I stood at the line anyway, empty-handed, and just breathed out slow, the way Gus taught me on a dock longer ago than I like to count. In 4 counts, out 6. The row of paper targets hung untouched, and I didn't fire a single round that day. I didn't need to. I needed to remember that the steadiest thing about me had never once come from that family, and it was still mine, staples and all, no matter what a friendly reporter printed about my memory. Preston called at midnight. I almost let it go to voicemail. I need to ask you something, he said, and for the first time in 29 years his voice had none of its usual polish in it. Doyle, at the gala, did he say anything to you before the toast? Anything strange? I told him what Elliot remembered: stay close to the stage, don't wander off. The silence on the line went on so long I thought the call had dropped. He told me the exact same thing, Preston said finally. I told myself it was just security being security. I've been telling myself that for 2 weeks straight. Another silence longer than the first. Nora, what if it wasn't? I didn't tell him everything that night, but I told him enough. And for the first time in 29 years, my brother didn't interrupt once, not to talk about himself, not for anything. 2 days before the vote, my doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. Marion Voss stood on my porch in yesterday's clothes, eyes swollen, a hard drive sitting in her open palm like she needed to hand it off before she changed her mind. He called my daughter's law school directly yesterday, she said. Asked about her financial aid status. Casual as anything. Just to make sure I understood exactly how far he could reach. Her jaw was set in a way I had never once seen on her in 15 years of client dinners. I have spent 28 years letting men like Marcus Doyle decide what I was allowed to be afraid of. I am done being afraid on his schedule instead of my own. She put the drive in my hand, invoices. Emails, a voicemail Doyle had left her, thinking he was being subtle, that was not remotely subtle at all. Elliot's contribution arrived that same morning, a call from his foundation's board president, a woman named Carol Jennings who had apparently been instructed to loop me in directly. The Grange Foundation was suspending all pending disbursements to every Calloway Hospitality property, effective immediately, pending clarity around recent events connected to the Lakeshore Gala. It would be a public statement by the end of the day. A foundation that size pulling funding wasn't a rumor or a source close to the family. It was a file dated, financial fact no PR team on earth could spin into a symptom of anybody's trauma. I didn't ask you to do that, I told him. I know. He was already reaching for his coat, choosing to anyway. Different thing. He paused at the door. Wear something you can stand up in for a while. Tomorrow's going to be long. The shareholder meeting was held in the Calloway Grand's largest conference room, 1 floor below the ballroom where I'd bled onto a marble floor a month earlier, close enough now that I could feel the thin pink line of scar tissue through my blouse with 2 fingers if I pressed. I wasn't on the agenda. I walked in anyway, Elliot half a step behind me, Marion Voss half a step behind him, and the room went quiet enough that I could hear the projector fan. My father was mid-sentence, something about resilience, about a family that had weathered the unthinkable together, when he saw me in the doorway. Nora, he recovered fast, he always did. You should be resting. I'd like to be recognized as a shareholder of record, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt standing on it. I have information relevant to the continuity clause vote. He tried the gentle concern voice next, the one straight out of the Planted article. This isn't the time or the place for. The entry angle on my gunshot wound was level, I said, over him to the room, not to him. Flat. The kind of shot a person takes standing still, feet planted. Not the kind a panicked man produces in a moving crowd. I've spent 20 years on a range and I know the difference in my own body, not just on a piece of paper somebody handed me. Somebody in the back row already had a phone out. Marion stepped forward and put the contents of that hard drive on the projector herself, her hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in my kitchen 3 days earlier. Invoices from Aldridge Risk Partners, dated 6 weeks before the gala. An email referencing creative options that would read well in the press. A voicemail, Doyle's own voice, threatening a woman's daughter's financial aid to keep her quiet, playing out loud to a silent room full of the exact people my father needed most in the world to believe him. An assistant read the Grange Foundation's statement into the record a moment later, effective immediately, pending a full independent investigation into the events of June the 4th. My father started to speak. Nothing came out that sounded like him. It was Preston who stood up. He told me to stay close to the stage, my brother said, to 400 people who would have believed anything he'd said a month earlier, and now watched him with the specific attention reserved for someone about to say something unforgivable about somebody else, Doyle, before the toast. I thought it was normal. He looked at our father, and whatever had been easy and golden in his face for 29 years was simply gone, all at once like a light switched off in another room. You wanted a clean shot of just me. That's what you always wanted. And somebody else wanted one too, and she took it instead, and you spent her surgery on the phone with me talking about how scared I must have been. The board called an emergency vote of no confidence within the hour. Marion delivered her files to the district attorney's office herself that same afternoon, in person, and told me afterward she'd rather lose her pension standing up than keep it lying down for one more year. My father lost the chairmanship first, then the boardroom, then, within a month, nearly every room that had ever mattered to him. He and my mother separated that autumn, and I heard about it the way I heard most things about my father by then, second-hand, from someone else's assistant. Marcus Doyle's name went into the same file, and so did Aldridge Risk Partners. Daniel Pruitt, it turned out, had been promised a paycheck, and told the gun would never actually be aimed at anyone. He was the first person to cooperate fully once he understood how far past that promise things had actually gone. My mother didn't say a single word through any of it. I watched her face while the room came apart around us, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something on it that hadn't been composed in advance for anyone's camera. 3 weeks later, my mother asked me what I wanted for dinner. It sounds like nothing. It was not nothing. 29 years of family dinners had orbited Preston's preferences by default and by silent agreement, and I had learned so early not to expect the question that I nearly missed it being asked at all. We sat at her kitchen table, not a ballroom, not a chapel arranged for a photographer's angle, just the three of us and a roast chicken nobody had staged for anybody. At one point she reached over and put her hand over mine, careful of the place where the staples used to be, and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Some corrections don't come as sentences. Preston stepped back from the CEO track the following month. He told the interim board, in front of people, that he wasn't ready and wasn't sure he ever should have been fast-tracked past people who actually knew how the hotels ran. During the board's public statement that week, he said my name into a live microphone, unprompted, the first time he'd done that in front of a camera since the gala. I noticed. I don't think I'll ever stop noticing things like that. He asked me afterward, quietly, no cameras within a mile of either of us, whether I'd consider taking the operating role for real this time, title included, instead of just doing the entire job without one. I'll think about it, I told him, and for once in my life I meant it in both directions at once. Elliot made me dinner that night in his own kitchen, nothing from any gala, just pasta and too much garlic and a room that smelled like a home instead of a venue built to be photographed. He stood behind my chair afterward and ran his thumb once slow, along my cheek, the exact unhurried way he used to check whether a wound was healing clean. What do you want? He asked in a voice nobody in my family had thought to use on me in 33 years. I told him, small things, ordinary things. A Tuesday with nothing scheduled on it, ice cream instead of dinner sometimes, for absolutely no reason, just because I wanted it. I didn't flinch saying it out loud, I didn't have to earn saying it either. Callaways don't flinch. My grandfather meant it as armor, a gift for a granddaughter nobody else thought needed one. My father turned it into a leash, a line he could pull whenever it suited the quarter. I finally got to decide what it meant on my own terms, not that I couldn't feel the hit when it landed, but that I got to choose, once and for all, whose hands were ever allowed anywhere near the trigger of my own life again. I was already loved, I just hadn't been standing where I could see it. I was already home. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.